Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the overarching issue of the globalist maniacal determination to control, 100% control the information flow to the public, the narrative, as it were, because it's not facts or useful information or accurate information. It is simply a narrative, the purpose of which is to sell or push globalization and crush any of those that disagree with or question globalization. That is the sole and only purpose of the narrative. And we need to understand that. And if we understand that, then how important it is to the globalists to keep control, and how much they would rejoice over people like Tucker Carlson or others being deplatformed, whether James O'Keefe and so on, whether it be temporary or not. Now, what sort of got me thinking about this in particular was a piece on Breitbart News, and a piece by James Pinkerton. And I'll go to it now. It's titled, although it covers other things, "Bringing the War on Terror Home to Target Americans for Disinformation." I'm just looking at the first paragraph here. The US government took the information management control techniques it learned after 9/11 and has turned them against Americans. I'm paraphrasing now. So America may have lost the Great War on Terror, but our technocratic elites could win their war against American liberty by controlling information and by controlling the narrative. So Breitbart News, James Pinkerton, well worth going over to have a look and have a read of that. I think he took it from, well, he did. He's quoting a piece that's from another journal here, but nonetheless, have a look at what James Pinkerton has to say there, because it's certainly well worth your time. Now, the information narrative, when sort of this is pre-internet, when the globalization sort of thing really kicked off big time, it was in the early 90s when the Soviet Union fell over. That's when, not that it hadn't been around, but that's when they really notched it up a couple of gears and started to accelerate the program of globalization. And there are a number of strands to that, and I'll come back to that sort of in a minute. But the key, or one of the key things, was information control. If you've got people, in the media and in newspapers or which were, of course, widespread in the pre-internet days, or the TV stations, the radio stations, and so on. If you've got people talking out against globalization, pointing out its destruction, pointing out how it's reducing the standard of living of Western citizens and all that sort of stuff, then you're going to have a tough time getting it across the line, pushing it further. It's going to be difficult for you to infiltrate all the institutions that you need to. So media control, and thus narrative control, was absolutely vital. Now, I sort of noticed this, even earlier than 1990 in the US in particular. I noticed that what later I came to realize was part of the wider globalist project, to set the genders and the races against each other, to infiltrate the political legal system, infiltrate the academic institutions, and so on. The apparatus and structure of Soviet subversion of the West was almost taken over completely by the globalists and used, almost unchanged, really, from what the Soviet agitators and underminers of Western society were doing. So I saw this, but it didn't quite sort of fit as to, well, why is this happening? And so I was bemused. And given I was doing a vast amount of international travel at the time, I was reading newspapers and watching TV or current affairs programs all over the world. And when you're when you're doing a lot of traveling, the last thing you just want to get back to your room and go to sleep, because you just seem to be going 18 hours a day, every day, meetings, breakfasts, lunches, dinners. I mean, it's just never ending. And so you really value the time to yourself, which means you get to sort of, sit down quietly, read a newspaper or have a look at a current affairs program wherever you are in the world. So I got to see an awful lot of the different types and began to see the pattern of propaganda pushing going on and to see how it was working. So by the early 90s, even in media outlets or newspapers or magazines that you'd consider sort of centre right, you'd be lucky to see any articles that would question or denounce globalization. They were all in some way all for it. And I started to see articles where you'd the writers who journalists were being replaced by activists, or alternatively journalists be saying, hey, if you want to keep your job, you need to be a fucking activist in support of globalization. Similarly, your magazines and media outlets were saying, well, hey, you won't get any advertising. You better promote globalization in your editorials and all that sort of stuff. Otherwise, you'll find your advertising revenue will drop off. So there are various methods to coerce and stand over and intimidate people who maybe otherwise wouldn't have done it. And there was a fair bit of that going on. I've met journalists that were intimidated, were told, look, you can't say that. We have to praise globalization. So you'd see articles like people from the third world, they have a right to come to the first world. They have a right to a good life. They have a right to a quality life. You'd start to see these things appearing. And so there was clearly a centrally controlled narrative. And everyone, people were getting their propaganda marching instructions from a central secretariat. And that was evident. I started to see many signs of it in the 1980s, but by the 1990s, I'm still a young guy at this point. By the 1990s, I'm thinking, holy shit, that this is coordinated. It's a coordinated campaign that's centrally scripted, and I started to see all those hallmarks. Again, if I hadn't been traveling internationally as much as I was on business, I probably wouldn't have noticed it, or would have taken longer before I was able to put the pieces together. But the globalists sort of had to control the media machine. They had to control the information flow. And it was to present globalization in the most positive light possible, to present it, look, that's how it is. That's how it's going to be. There's nothing you can do about it. You might as well just accept it. And that's it. And also to suppress, intimidate, denounce, deplatform anyone that would talk against it. Now, it's not that hard when you control the media institutions to make sure that it's a top-down thing. Look, I don't want any of your journalists complaining about globalization, and then they would, and also there'd be very generous, advertising things where certain people would pay top dollar for the advertising in order to make keep these media outlets in the pro-globalist camp. But the globalists knew that they just couldn't sustain sunlight or criticism or anyone talking about what they're doing. They just globalization just couldn't proceed if they had that criticism that an independent media would inflict on them. So that they couldn't hold up to that. So like a centrally controlled communist media system, the criticism or questions, globalization couldn't sustain it. It was that shaky and that flaky and that useless that it could, nor could they win the debate of ideas. They just couldn't win it. So the only option they had was narrative control and shutting down any questions. Now, they could do that through the mainstream media, but then along came the internet, and that kind of changed the game. So they had to then invent or create a second layer of control, media control, to control social media, online discussion, and so on, which is what, of course, we're seeing now. So that anyone that questioned COVID or questions, the climate change activism or questions mass migration or any of the central planks of globalization, the levers, of globalization, anyone that does that is condemned as pushing misinformation or disinformation. And it's like accusing someone of being a Nazi. So, because they don't deserve legal rights because they're Nazis. Well, they don't deserve a public platform because they disagree with the narrative. Shut them down. So it becomes almost a self-fulfilling loop where arbitrary moral judgments are passed on those that have differing opinions, and then shut them down. Take them at the back and shoot them, for God's sake. So this is what's going on at the moment now. Different areas of the social media. Some free expression is still allowed. If it is allowed, then the videos are suppressed or deboosted, and there's also any particularly the younger social media folks. If any of the younger ones who get a good following amongst younger people, James Allsop is one example of that. But there are others that get a strong following, then they're viewed as a threat. Particularly if they're getting a following amongst young people, because that's considered to be the prime globalist control group there. So they're deplatformed and kicked off all social media on really just nonsense, nonsense accusations and with rules and conditions and so on that are very vaguely written and even more vaguely and arbitrarily applied. But the control of the media narrative, or the control of the information narrative, is it. Without that narrative control, the globalist project is fucked. And they know that, which is why they're so desperate to maintain control and to shut down all alternative voices. And they're not fussed how they do it. The annoying thing about the Second Amendment in the United States and the courts and freedom of the press and so on, that all gets in the way and it's all got to go. So they're devising, or have already got, activist courts. The CIA and the FBI have infiltrated, often are in partnership with, whether it be Twitter or other media organisations. Look at the extent that Mark Zuckerberg went to influence the election, a number of elections. This is, I don't think we've ever seen such a massive investment in supporting, whilst purporting to have a free platform, a free media platform, is also at the same time very actively, very aggressively, and they're spending huge bucks supporting one side, the globalist side of politics against the other. These sorts of things are new territory. But really, no one is, there's no influential body anywhere. You can look at, say, Ron DeSantis and there's a few others, but really there's no serious pushback against the media control effort and the idea of strangling off any voice alternative to the globalist narrative. There's no, there should be massive pushback against that. There should be outrage all across the Western world, but in fact there's none, or very little, hardly any. And so really the screws are tightening every day on removing any voices other than the globalist narrative voices. And that's something that we should all be very concerned about. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.